very good afternoon and thank you for joining us for this edition right here. We are going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the refugees, rural and urban people. Yes, how have they been impacted by COVID-19 in the context of gender and disability? I do have 6 guests in studio. Well, 3 of them will be in studio and 3 via Skype or Zoom. But let me give you a preamble into this conversation. Care International in Uganda conducted a rapid gender analysis, that is an RGA, to explore how COVID-19 is affecting men, women, boys and girls with and without disability from refugee and non-refugee backgrounds. Well, in the urban, rural and settlement contexts, the findings show how COVID-19 has and continues to disproportionately affect communities, especially women and girls, in various ways, including, well, adverse impact on their gender roles, relations, health, education, food security, and nutrition livelihoods. Well, and protection too. We are joined by a team from Office of the Prime Minister, Care, Humanity and Inclusion, and Nuodu to discuss the findings on the impact of COVID-19 on gender and persons with disabilities in refugees and host community context. And well, they'll be sharing their recommendations, which will provide reference to various stakeholders in the mitigating, preventing and responding to the negative effects of the pandemic in Uganda. Well, joining me in studio, I do have Miss Ayebare Dorin. Well, she is the project manager at Care International. I also have Mr. Innocent right there from the Office of the Prime Minister from the Department of Refugees. He'll be letting us know why the over 800,000 South Sudanese that are in Uganda haven't been repatriated to their to their country, even though we did see a peace agreement being signed between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. I also do have Dorothy Namara. She is the country technical advisor at Humanity and Inclusion. And via Skype, we are joined by Michelle Sahabo Senkumba. She's the Emergency Program Manager at Care International. There she is. A very good afternoon, Michelle. Thank you for joining us. I also do have Nangonzi Anet Chambade via Skype. She is the GBV and Protection Manager at Care International. She will be joining us on the Skype or Zoom. I also do have Miss Teresa Leber. She's a social worker working with the Union. She's working with the National Union for Women with Disabilities, and she joins us via Skype, as you can see right there. Very good afternoon, Ms. Teresa. Thank you for joining us. There she is. Well, and in studio right here, I do have Ms. Ayebare, I also have Dorothy, and I also have Mr. Innocent from the OPM. They're going to give us a brief understanding of what they do. I'm going to start with you from the left. Project Manager, what are you doing at Care International? Briefly help the viewer understand.
Thank you very much, Romeo. At Care International, we basically work on programming of people who are vulnerable, specifically women and girls, and our focus is on the women and girls who are at risk of sexual exploitation and violence, gender-based violence, so to say. We also address issues of social justice and poverty on the overall. We work across the different contexts, that is in development context, humanitarian context, and also, of course, looking at issues of refugees and host communities. Globally, Care works in over 90 countries, and in Uganda, Care started operating in 1969. Thank you.
Anyway, we'll have Michelle expound on that to tell us the 3 great portfolio projects that you're working on right now. But then I also do have Innocent right there in the middle from the Office of the Prime Minister, Department of Refugees. Help us understand briefly what you do at the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Romeo. Office of the Prime Minister is the overall ministry that is charged with the business of government, and it has a number of departments, and relevant to today's subject is the Department of Refugees. The Department of Refugees is charged with refugee protection and management in Uganda, and it's established under the Refugees Act of 2006 and the Refugees Regulations of 2010. And Under that department, we mainly coordinate all matters relating to refugees amongst the different government ministries, departments, and agencies, and as well as the various organizations, national and international. And it's also the Department of Refugees that is basically mandated with overall protection of refugees in the country. And in this department, we also handle the refugee registration as they come in the country. And currently, we have a total of 1,400,000 refugees in the country, the majority of whom are from South Sudan, around 880,000, followed by those from DRC, and then Burundi, and many others from other countries. The Department of Refugees also coordinates and monitors, different refugee-related programs, and also does not only deal with issues of refugees, but also now goes ahead to liaise with various issues of, or activities meant to support the host communities that live side by side with these refugees in Uganda. So basically, that's what the department does.
That is amazing. I also do have on the far left, Doreen right there representing, Dorothy is representing Humanity and Inclusion. Dorothy Namara, you're representing Humanity and Inclusion. Help us understand what you do.
Okay, thank you very much. Humanity and Inclusion operates under a new name of Handicap International. It is an impartial, independent organization that works with persons with disability, but other vulnerable populations. Globally, we are existent in 60 countries, and we are looking at various activities ranging from inclusion to mental health to physical rehabilitation. But particularly in Uganda, where we are 3 years old, we are looking at activities of, just like I said, mental health and psychosocial support, physical rehabilitation, sexual reproductive health. And just to be in line with this topic today, we have a project that is Wish to Action, funded by UK Aid, that looks at accessibility of sexual reproductive services to persons with disability. And that gives an intersection between gender and disability. We are in 6 districts in Uganda, but we are going to expand to more than that, around 4 more districts this year. We work in partnership with various stakeholders. We work in partnership with government. We work in partnership with UN agencies like Refugees, the Refugee organization. We work with local communities, we work with local leadership, and also organizations of persons with disability. Case in point is Nwodu, that is on the show today. So yes.
Amazing. Dorothy Namara, she's a country technical advisor for Humanity and Inclusion. Over to Zoom or Skype, we also have some 3 guests. We do have Mrs. Teresa Leber. She's a social worker with the National Union for National Union for Women with Disabilities, and she joins us via Skype. A very good afternoon, Ms. Teresa. What can you tell us about Nwodu and what you do?
National umbrella organization of girls and women with disabilities. Formed in 1999, Nwodu, located on Chisasi Chanja Road, has the mission to promote the social, cultural, economic, and political advancement of girls and women with disabilities for their effective participation in development. The organization does this through its membership, who are the district associations of women with disabilities, cross-disability organizations, and organizations of parents with children or persons with disabilities. Nowudu has programs grounded on the following: advocacy, capacity building, research and documentation, resource mobilization, gender mainstreaming, networking, partnership, and economic empowerment. From 2016, NWUD also extended its services to the refugees with disabilities, specifically female refugees with disabilities, first in the western region, in Oruchinga and Nachivale settlements, and refugees with disabilities who here in Kampala. And from 2018, NWUD extended its services to female refugees with disabilities in Bidibidi refugee settlement in West Nile. The organization has programs in 22 districts, namely Amuria, Kasese, Tororo, Gulu, Nuoya, Amuru, Tororo, Kiriadongo, Oyam, among others. However, all these programs are supported by partners and donors. NWUD also works with national and international women organizations. As a result, NWUD is in close working relationship with the Forward, UONET, among others. I think
Ms. Leba, we also do have via Skype and Zoom, we also do have Michelle from Care International. Michelle, Care International is implementing 3 large projects or portfolios. What can you tell us about those programs? Michelle, if you can hear me, Care International is implementing 3 large portfolios or projects. What can you tell us about those?
Good afternoon, and apologies for that. Indeed, Care International in Uganda has been present 51 years now, and currently it's implementing 3 large programs. The first one is around women and youth financial inclusion, so anything to do with empowering women and youth financially. The second one is about women's empowerment in regards to natural resource governance. And the third one, which I manage, is a program on emergencies. So it's everything regarding response and preparedness, regards to refugee response or other disaster response. Yes, and generally what we do is, in Care, we aim to, of course, save lives and improve the dignity of our beneficiaries. And through these programs that I've just explained, between July 2017 and June 2019, we've reached over 3 million beneficiaries across the country through these interventions, directly and indirectly. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Also via Skype, we do have Annette, a GBV and protection officer, who will be joining us later on as we proceed with this show. But in studio, I have Doreen, Mr. Innocent, and Dorothy. Yes, in that order. And we are going to be having this conversation on the impact of COVID-19 on gender and disability in the context of the refugees, urban and rural settlements. Let me start with you, Doreen. Especially the viewer who is watching right now would want to know, why did you go out of your way, despite, you know, the emergency of COVID-19? We were grappling, some people were under lockdown, but somehow Care International felt it was prudent to go out there and conduct the rapid gender analysis study. Why?
Thank you very much. So when we just looking at the word rapid, it's just a quick assessment to check what are the implications of a crisis on the different categories of people, where we're looking at men, women, girls and boys. So we set out to see what are the socio-economic implications of this crisis on the people we serve in the communities. And we thought that doing this study across board, when you're looking at the refugee context, the urban context and the development context, a comparative analysis of how the implications are playing out. When we did the gender analysis, we were looking at different areas, and those would include roles and responsibilities, what's happening at family and what's happening at community. We look at access to services, and more specifically, we zoomed in on sexual reproductive health services. And then we went into, we know information is very key during crisis, and we're checking in, does everyone have equal access or equitable access to information? Because if they're going to prevent or to, you know, manage the crisis, are they receiving the rightful information? So we checked it in on that. We also checked, we know there's, you know, the task forces that are being formed, the COVID committees that are there, both at national and at district and at regional and in grassroots communities. How are women being involved in these processes? Is everyone participating? Is decision making involving all, and are concerns of everybody equally addressed? So we thought when you go in there and establish the implications, then you design strategies that are suitable. Because we've been with our programming, the way it has been, but the times are different. We are now saying the new normal, but how does the new normal look like?
Indeed.
So we went in there to assess what that looks like, what are the implications, and what are the practical recommendations. So we come here to share our findings, to be able to, you know, look at the different response actors, to look at government and say, this is what it looks like, this is what we can do differently, this is how we can adapt. And we also hope to share some of the things that CARE and, you know, Humanity Inclusion have already done in terms of adapting programming to suit the times. Thank you.
So what were your findings?
The findings are broad, and I think that's why we're all here ourselves, the teams that are coming in via Zoom, in terms of, you know, what is specific. I don't know if I will, you know, just come in there, but just to say broadly is that, you know, we are calling it an emergency. Many times people will go straight to think emergency humanitarian context. But one thing we like to say, we would like to bring forth is that actually this crisis is across board. Whether men or women or girls or boys. Of course, we know they're vulnerable categories, like the refugees, like the people with disabilities, like the women, like the girls. There you'll find that the implications are more biting to those categories. So we shall get into the detail of all that, but coming in with an understanding that actually across all contexts, the situations might be different, but everyone was actually impacted upon.
And we also have Dorothy Namara from Humanity and Inclusion. They did conduct an impact assessment study, especially on people living in refugees. Help us understand what you found out.
We looked at a rapid impact assessment on our beneficiaries. Those are persons with disabilities specifically. And we are looking at different dimensions of this, and we're looking at one, like my colleague has said, about information, accessibility, about education, about food, about living conditions generally, and access to different services of health, etc. So we were able to have findings. I would say that study is still ongoing. It's going to, you know, we will be able to produce a report time to come, but we have preliminary findings out of this, and out of that we found out that certain persons with disabilities are actually impacted negatively in these areas of health, in areas of access to food, areas of limited transportation, which later bring long-term effects in terms of, let's say, mental health and psychosocial support and any other services.
And of course, we do have Innocent from the Office of the Prime Minister, the Department of Refugees. Before we get into the conversation on gender and disability, we would like to know, in Uganda here, we have over 1.4 million plus refugees living in our communities and the refugee settlements. 80,000 of those are living in the rural and the urban centers. But then we want to understand the 800,000 South Sudan refugees and the fact that we have witnessed the signing of a peace agreement in South Sudan. Why has it taken forever to repatriate these refugees back home, where we believe they can be best taken care of?
Yes, thank you. Repatriation of refugees, it's not something that is done over a week, over a month. It's a process.
Indeed.
Uganda as a country has been part of the other special regional countries and international community that has been really supporting and doing everything possible to see that our neighbor South Sudan goes back to peace. And we saw peace. We saw an agreement signed last year. A unity government has just been formed a few months ago, and usually what ordinarily was going to happen if it had not been for this COVID-19 outbreak would now start, discussions, what we call tripartite discussions between the country of origin, then the host country, which is Uganda, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to see how we can now plan and discuss and do consultations with the refugees here, so that we do a voluntary repatriation, which is usually done in safety and dignity. So it's a process. So we hope once this COVID-19 situation, ceases, definitely that will be the next subject. We will expect the Republic of South Sudan to definitely reach us out, and even the persons of concern, the refugees here, will be assessing the situation. Definitely they want to go back home.
But of course, you have the World Health Organization telling us that we might be dealing with a second wave of COVID-19. I'm talking about August, October, all the way to September. So would that actually put that program in would that program be hanging in the balance?
As the situation is, we cannot really start discussing repatriation, because as you see, countries have crossed borders. Whoever is in a country is really inside. We can discuss, we can have that kind of topic once the COVID-19 situation really eases.
And we also understand that for those refugees in the settlements, Changwali, Omugo, Palabek, they're being taken care of by the central government. One, you also have World Food Program, which actually cut off the number, the rations of food by 30%. How did that affect the people within those settlements?
Definitely this has had a negative effect on these persons of concern, because looking at even the current situation, it was like a double strategy, a double kind of problem. But all refugees living in the settlements actually try to have some kind of self-reliance. So they have some, farms, some gardens, they dig, they engage in some, small trade. So it's only that with this kind of situation, now they cannot do all that. So with the 70% now ration being given to them, it's also a challenge, but we are definitely discussing with our development partners and humanitarian partners to see how these food ratios can be again raised, so that the situation normalizes, and also emphasizing and ensuring that we really strengthen the self-reliance kind of strategy, so that these people actually do not have to always wait for food to be given to them.
But of course, these people are getting some kind of food, but then we're also talking about refugees out of the settlements. Those who are in the urban centers. What are you doing to help them?
The refugees who are living out of the settlements have really been affected grossly by this COVID-19. just like all other Ugandans and people living in Uganda in urban areas. With the current government food relief supplies which government is providing in especially Kampala and Wakiso, refugees who are living in these communities have also been part of the vulnerable people who have received this food. But the UNHCR and World Food Program have also gotten some funding, and they are supposed to be giving a one-off cash assistance to all these refugees who are living in Kampala and Wakiso anytime within this week. Also, the Prime Minister has already cleared that activity. So anytime this week, they will be getting this one-off cash assistance.
Okay, away from the refugees, let's talk about family relations with Doreen first. I'm going to ask you how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted on the roles and responsibilities, specifically on the burden of care at the household level.
Thank you very much. I guess I'll just start it by looking at the gender, the cut in the gender roles and responsibilities between men and women. For us to understand it, we need to know how has our social cultural norms placed us in society. Where are the women, where are the men? And as this burden comes in, how are each of us affected differently? So for us to understand, we see what are the roles of women, what are the roles of men. So if I'm going to discuss burden of care, I'm specifically coming into looking at the women largely, because the women are responsible for taking care of everyone in the home. The women are the ones who, you know, will look after whether you're sick or you're fine, the day-to-day needs of people in the house, all the chores in the households. Normally it's the women and the girls. So with the burden of care, you realize that during this crisis, much as we don't have many families affected, there's still the fact that there is a lockdown, everyone is at home. No one is leaving home. The children are not going to school. The people who used to work away from home have now come home because of the lockdown. What does that mean? The family is full. So what happens to the clock for the lady or the mother or the child, the girl child, is that you're working right from morning to the evening.
More unpaid work.
More unpaid work for them. And beyond that is that from the survey, we realize that the mothers are more cautious about their children going out. They don't want them to go to the water points. They don't want them to go to fetch food or even, you know, go to the shops and pick something. So you end up stepping in to do everything. And then that means, you know, what are the implications of all that work on the mothers, on the women? And so we see that increasing largely because of the household chores. But a slight trend that could be seen in this time that could be a positive is that as the men are staying home, some of them are beginning to appreciate. Some of them were cognizant of, oh, I didn't realize how good, you know, it is to spend time with the children. Or, you know, they've started in a bid to keep themselves busy, they're doing some work.
So there are some positives.
Yeah, so there's some positive, but us as response actors, we need to pick on that. Maybe we roll in our male engagement strategies in order to count on that and mobilize them further and encourage them to stick to that, so that it's not just a COVID state, but it grows. And those that are doing it better can inspire others that are actually doing it. But I also wanted to look at the challenge of working mothers. Right now, it's all about, you know, work from home, work remotely, Zoom, Skype meetings from morning to evening. But when you're at home, you step into your mother role. And what does that mean? You must fulfill those roles. Your children, your husband are expecting you to do the everyday work that you do when you're home. So how do you balance the two? And the organization cognizant of that and actually flexing it so that, you know, maybe the meetings are starting late so that people can step in and do their chores, make breakfast for the children, do a bit of cleaning up, and then you start, because you can't keep to the normal office hours while you're at home. So I think it has created a more challenge for working mothers who are at home, but also the other non-working mothers. And yeah, that's what it's looked like.
And it's amazing that even though the women are doing the most, the men are still, you know, doing the decision making. If a woman goes out there, you know, sells from her subsistence farming some 200,000, she'll need the permission from the husband on how best to actually spend that money. Let me bring in Dorothy from Humanity and Inclusion. Help us understand the implications of COVID-19 at the household level from your perspective as Humanity and Inclusion.
Thank you very much. Just drawing from Doreen's submission on the burden of care of mothers, I want to take it to an angle where we look at children with specific disabilities, and these I would look at developmental disorders or difficulties among children.
Autistic children.
Or autistic children that really, really need a lot of time with these mothers. And they first of all do not understand the situation at hand, and they engage in activities that need more attention from the mothers, activities on stimulation, activities on therapy, activities on adapting to the new environments at home in terms of learning. So it is quite a burden onto the parents, onto the caretakers. And when I take it back to the settlement setting, where even these services are minimal, we see quite a bigger gap in there. And I think in our interventions as a humanity and inclusion, we have been able to reach out a little bit to a few most at risk, and those are the ones that we are looking at on household level, where we have been able to empower the parents with how to deal with these kind of sessions with the children. We have inclusive education officers that do that. We have physiotherapists, we have occupational therapists that actually do this work within at household level, but also taking into consideration the precautions and preventative measures in this state of time.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring in Teresa Leber. She is a social worker working with the National Union for Women with Disabilities. I would like to know what the impact on COVID-19 has been for our persons living with disabilities at the community level. Teresa, please take it away. Yes, Teresa, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on persons living with disabilities at the household level? Yes, we are still establishing that communication line with Teresa Leber. She's a social worker working with the National Union for Women with Disabilities, but we shall get back to her a little bit later. But I do have Doreen, Mr. Innocent, and also Dorothy from Humanity and Inclusion. Maybe I'll just chip in right there, Mr. Innocent. Let's talk about what OPM is doing to help persons with disabilities access all the information that they need regarding COVID-19. The impact assessment report by Humanity and Inclusion and also the rapid gender analysis study by Care International actually indicated that 47% of the respondents in these settlements do not know about COVID-19 or where to find information about COVID-19. What is happening? Is someone at the OPM sleeping?
It's not true, really. Where the Office of the Prime Minister, Department of Refugees is actually decentralized, and as we speak, even through this lockdown, we have officers up to the settlement level. And Office of the Prime Minister per se does not really implement in these refugee settlements, but rather really does the coordination and the monitoring role. And that's why you see that we work so closely with various partners, including Care here and Humanitarian and Inclusion, to see that our different persons of concern in the settlements are served. And of course, they have different needs. Some really have special needs, like the persons with disabilities. And that's why among our partners, we have actually partners like Humanitarian and Inclusion who are specifically serving refugees with disability. But in the whole, we also don't work with only the partners, but we also work with refugees, especially to enable us, to help us fulfill our administrative functions in managing these refugee settlements. So we have Refugee Welfare Council committees, which are equivalent to our local council LC system. So we have a local Refugee Welfare Council 1, Refugee Welfare Council 2, and the overall Refugee Welfare Council 3. So these are refugees, and they are the ones we really work with to especially ensure that sensitizations are made, sensitizations of like these kinds of situations, the COVID-19. We've only had a small challenge of interpretations of these messages. As you see, it always it's top bottom. All these policies, all these guidelines are coming from the center up to the grassroots. So our team at settlement levels are closely working with the district task forces, and whatever they get from the district task forces, all this is being disseminated in the refugee settlement.
Okay, Innocent, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to bring in Michelle, who is at Changwali settlement, to help us understand how dire the situation is in these refugee settlements. Michelle, we are hearing that 10% of persons living with disabilities, especially those in the refugee settlements, even those outside, 10% of those people actually have access to primary education. And out of those 10%, only 5% actually make it to secondary education. But then help us understand, according to the rapid gender analysis study that you conducted, which also indicates that 19% of people in the refugee settlements have resigned to faith. They're now just praying. 19% are saying even the help they got from their family members isn't enough, while the majority are saying they don't know how they'll get through this situation. But from your perspective, Michelle, help us paint a picture of how dire the situation is in those refugee settlements, especially in Changwali where you are.
Okay, thank you. The situation is dire because there's a lot of issues that are affecting this situation. So there are children who can't go to school and have no access to educational materials. So they are idle at home and they're missing out on really critical learning, especially those in T7 who are closing off the year. Secondly, in regards to livelihood, there's a lot of agriculture that happens in Changwali. We're really blessed with very fertile soils here. Okay. However, there was a gap in terms of inputs for agriculture. So you find that even those who are able to do some agricultural activities and get some food additional to what WFP provides are not able to do so right now. So it becomes even trickier. And of course, the limitation of movements also means that for those, perhaps the women, the girls, the men and boys who could potentially go to the host community to do some odd jobs to get money, now cannot. Because they can't access borders, and as much as you can walk, the distances are very long. So they can't access alternative means of getting some kind of income. So it is difficult, it is challenging, but I believe slowly we will find solutions. It's really about adapting.
So how best can those people in those refugee settlements adapt and cope with this situation?
Well, there are certain ways. For example, WFP is trying to provide money for 2 months, basically, so that they're able to manage it better instead of a monthly, money for food. So basically, with that, you can find that some refugees are buying maybe tools or things that can actually help them create an income and create additional resources for them. So you're finding bits and odds, and some are actually selling some of the food they have. Others are still trying the best to cultivate what they can. For example, right now it's a high season for pineapple, so they sell that and they get some money to then be able to feed their families further. But it's a bit complicated right now, with challenges even with collecting firewood. But everybody's trying their bits, but it's really not, these are not sustainable solutions, not at all.
Talk about the access to education within these settlements and also outside. How has COVID-19 impacted access to education?
Well, for starters, the schools are closed, so that's a big problem. And the information I received last week is that it's even difficult because the teachers are trying to do outreaches to support the students, refugee settlements and outside in the host community, to help students to go through their educational materials, the one that was provided by the Ministry of Education. However, it's difficult. Some of these teachers don't even have a bicycle, and the children are spread across the huge district, so it's complicated. Another challenge with education is that most of the refugee and host community students have illiterate parents. So at home itself, the students don't actually get persons to help them with their work, unlike perhaps in urban settings like Kampala, where your parents can help a bit. Here it's challenging. The student actually doesn't have anybody to go through the work with them, and so it also makes them lag behind. So those are the main gaps in education right now.
And of course, Michelle, during public health emergencies, access to accurate information is really vital. Now, based on the findings from the CARE International report, do you think men and women are having equal access to information?
Certainly not. Certainly not. What we found is that because of the increased burden on women and girls in the household, you find that women tend to stay home. So even if they do move, it's to the water point, to the forest, maybe to collect firewood. And what happens is the men tend to go find alternative income generating activities. So you'll find they end up at the markets, they end up at the trading centers, and so they get to have access to more information. So we have various means of passing on information. The one that's working really well right now is through the community-based facilitators. So these are refugees and host community members that go around every single part of the settlement and part of the host communities with megaphones, passing on messages. But there's also these public address systems that are mounted on borders, and these borders now reach a wider population. So these borders go to popular areas, so the markets, the trading center. So the men get that information from there. However, the women who are deep in the villages and in the settlements at home may not actually hear that information. So they have to rely on their friends or on posters perhaps, or if they're lucky enough to go to the trading center often. But also some of the positive impact is the men come back home and share with the families, the whole family, all the information they received. So that's also been a positive we found.
So what would be the immediate recommendations, in your opinion, to overcome these challenges?
Well, the immediate recommendation for me would be to really ensure that our means of community engagement and communication actually reach the deepest and the most vulnerable. So we're looking at, an elderly person who's perhaps disabled and lives deep in the village. How will they get information? So what's the best means? You have to assess depending on the context. It could be radio if you're in an urban area, but in a deep rural settlement type of context, you need perhaps a community volunteer on a bicycle with a megaphone. So what I would recommend is to analyze within each context what is the best means to reach the most marginalized and furthest community member, and then use that method. And it will work if that's done.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that submission. I'll go back to my studio guests. I do have Doreen, Innocent in the middle, and Dorothy. I'm coming to you, Mr. Innocent in the middle, or PM. Let's talk about the Village Savings and Loans Association, because right now we are talking about livelihoods. And these Village Savings and Loans Associations used to offer some kind of safety net for our people. Now, in COVID-19 era, these are no more. These Village Savings and Loans Associations would actually have 10 to 30 people, but now you have COVID-19 measures calling for only 5 people to be in groups. So how has that affected these Village Savings and Loans Associations, and also impacted negatively on the lives of those people who used to depend on these schemes? The women, 80%. If you look at the CARE International assessment study in Gulu, Amuru, 80% of the people in these Village Savings and Loans Associations are women. So how have they been impacted by the fact that they cannot actually go ahead with these schemes?
Thank you. Frankly, the COVID-19 has heavily impacted economically on this country. And this is to both the refugees and even the host communities and Ugandans at large in the country. And as government, there are a lot of discussions ongoing to see how Ugandans can be supported, to recover economically. And I think just the other week, Bank of Uganda gave even guidelines credit relief guidelines to all banking institutions, to see how they can reduce the financial impact and caused or brought about by this COVID-19. Now, regarding the refugee situation, or the refugees in the settlement, especially these savings groups, government is also working closely with the UN system in Uganda, and just the last month, government together with the UN system in Uganda launched the UN emergency appeal kind of fund for this, COVID-19, totaling about 316 million US dollars. So we hope and we are looking forward to see our UN system in Uganda, the UN agencies, the development partners, contribute to this fund, which is meant to support the vulnerable persons, communities, groups in the country, including refugees, issues like livelihoods or these kinds of village savings, the women, persons with disabilities, and all this is both in the settlements and in the host communities and across the country. So as government, of course, we're also having the government appeal fund, and we really thank everyone who is contributing to it. We hope all of this can come in handy to support all these kinds of negative impacts. And there are ongoing discussions at policy levels on what kind of policies can be be brought or be brought on board to see that these economic impacts are really handled, and somehow as government, I think that looked ahead, we have a whole economic monitoring actually docket in the office of the president, headed politically by Honorable Moleka Mukama, who is the Minister for Economic Monitoring. So they are doing all these, assessments and monitoring together with the Minister of Finance and Bank of Uganda to see that economically we are, assisted to manage all these impacts.
And of course, Innocent, at this time of COVID-19, we are heavily dependent on the women. Did you know that? Who are, 80% in subsistence farming. And the women are complaining due to the COVID-19 measures that were put in place to cap the spread of the disease. You have women now who are complaining that they do not have access to some farming inputs, the chemicals, the fertilizers that they need. They cannot access them right now. How are you helping these farmers at such a time?
Thank you. Of course, the helm of this outbreak, we really crossed the number of services, but for the last, I think, almost 3 weeks now, traders who are dealing with these farming inputs have been allowed to open shops, and it's now one of the essential services which is really open. And really, as a country, we are actually encouraging farming because it's our backbone, and we actually think we can leverage on it during this kind of period, because if you notice, it's the only sector which actually did not cross throughout this whole period. So farmers continued farming. They did not at all get any interruptions, save for maybe a week or two, but these traders were allowed to open, and any farmer can now access these farming inputs.
At this point in time, let's discuss the issue of gender and disability. This goes to you, Dorothy, right there in the far left. Now, various people have different perceptions on gender and disability. So in your own opinion, what does this mean to you? And what is that intersectionality? Help us understand that.
Thank you. When we talk about intersectionality between gender and disability, we are looking at interplay of social factors that bring about discrimination of this individual at certain levels. And before you talk about actually discrimination, you should be able to understand that discrimination comes about out of different factors. And for us to understand that, I could bring an example of a woman who is disabled, and living in a COVID crisis, if I may bring that. This is called a double vulnerability. We all know what the perception of women are in our societies, and when we bring in a person or the disability component, we look, society defines it differently. Normally they are stereotyped. There are so many stereotypes. Women with disabilities or persons with disabilities are actually dependent, are helpless, are all those things that you may name. And all that impacts onto brings about that connectivity between gender and disability. And one other issue is on different services. For example, we see, let's say, sexual reproductive health services. One of the things that interacts there mostly is the attitude of service providers, where it comes in as a negative impact, where
attitudinal problems.
Yes, attitudinal problems. Persons with disabilities are looked at as people who cannot even make informed decisions on what services they need regarding family planning, or even have intimate relationships at that. So it is quite an intersection. It's an interplay of different social factors, depending on race, depending on class, depending on gender, just like you see it. So one other thing that I want to appeal is that as we are looking at gender and disability, we look at those other factors that actually contribute, or that makes the discrimination evident, that makes the discrimination bigger, that makes the vulnerability gap very big in this. Yeah.
Dorothy, is it true that boys with disabilities are actually actually prioritized more than the girls with disabilities? Is it true? Is this happening?
In our study, we didn't really bring this out, but drawing from different crises, examples from different crises, we have seen this happening. And in the midst of resources and cultural context, just like Michelle was saying, we prioritize. Mostly boys are more prioritized than girls. Why? Because they are seen as people people that can make it in life than girls. And looking at the perception of women in the community also draws fronting of boys than girls to education or to access education. So one of the things that I also appeal is to see, yes, we have had so much on girl child education, but I would also want to see much of children or girls with disabilities rise up to that level and attain a certain level of education and sustainability in life.
That is amazing. Dorothy, right there from Humanity and Inclusion. I also do have Miss Leba Teresa via Zoom. I don't know if we've established a connection with her, but I wanted her to give us an explanation on how people with disabilities are being affected at this point in time. Doreen, do you have any more submissions on that, on what she's saying?
I'll probably just come back to the bit around the economic implications for the women. And of course, when we say the women, we are not excluding the women with disabilities. And where she says actually that it's double tragedy or double vulnerability.
You're a woman and you're disabled, so double discrimination.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring it back, like, when the women actually largely depend on the informal networks for their sustenance economically and socially. So in this whole COVID-19 crisis, there has been a challenge in terms, we talked of access to information.
Yeah.
For the women, many times they access information from the groups. When they meet in their groups, that's their learning space. That's their safe space to speak. So when the groups have been stopped, that already is a clear communication that they are not having space where they can get information from. But also on the other hand is that these VSLAs are a space where they have been, doing their savings, getting loans. Right now, when COVID came in, the first point they went to was to withdraw their savings.
Yes.
And what did that mean? where are they going to start from? How does that group come back? We did a quick check-in within some of the groups who engage in Gulu and Arua, and a good number of them had stopped saving. Of course, there is a level of the group's maturity at that point. Where is the group at that point in time? For those that were very mature and their businesses are very stable, especially like we see that in Western Uganda, the Bushenyi side, in that space, they have been able to continue because they can, you know, still send produce to the city. But when you come to the vulnerable communities with people dealing in the small informal sector, they don't have any money, any more money to save. Their businesses are down, and recovery will be quite difficult. So we see all that happening, and we need to start thinking. We are speaking about adaptation. Of course, we keep saying post-COVID, but when is COVID ending? We don't know.
Yes.
But I think as actors, we already need to start doing the adaptations. In this emergency, I think personally, and I think what our organization is learning, is to adapt, you know, check in, is it working? What do you need to do differently? That kind of flexibility around programming so that you respond to every issue as it comes and kind of keep relevant to the people we serve.
Of course, access to information for our women in the rural areas has also been a challenge. Like you say, they get the information when they go for these village savings and loans associations. They get the information when they go to the water points. So we'd like to know, how are these women in the rural areas accessing information on COVID-19?
There is a limitation, like we have already said, but one thing that CARE is doing, and I think other actors possibly, is the bit around using community structures. So the good thing is that we already had community structures established, who we call the community-based facilitators, the community-based structures. Some people are kind of tapping on the LC structure and the RWCs in the refugee setup. And when you give them information, they're doing the house-to-house. When we do the house-to-house, what comes to us first is, are we providing the protective equipment for the people who are doing community? Because we can't run out from that. So we give them ample information around protecting themselves, maintaining social distance, but also information they need to deliver from house to house. So we found the community structures very influential, working in both rural, urban, and the refugee context.
Doreen, thank you very much. We also have Innocent in the middle from the OPM and Dorothy from Humanity and Inclusion. On that is Zoom, we have Teresa Leba. She's the social worker working with the National Union for Women with Disabilities. Yes, and they also have Annette. She's a GBV and Protection Officer from CARE International, and also Michelle. But we're going to take a very short break. We'll be right back with more information. Keep it here on NTV. We have a lot more. Welcome back to NTV. Today we are discussing the impact of COVID-19 on people living in refugee settlements. Not only those people, also people living in the rural and urban settlements, also the issue of gender and disability. I do have Doreen, Innocent from OPM, and Dorothy from Humanity and Inclusion. Let's continue with Dorothy, let me come to you on the issue of persons living with disabilities and how best they are trying to cope during these very, very trying times. Let's talk about sexual and reproductive and maternal health services. How has COVID-19 impacted on the access to sexual and reproductive maternal and health services?
Thank you. On that, we see quite a big impact. One comes through, like the one I've said before, attitudinal barriers, where service providers actually giving a negative attitude towards this. But we also see difficulty in accessibility of these services. One of the things that is peculiar with persons with disability is that they depend on other people, they depend on other services for them to move, especially those that have mobility challenges. So this has impacted greatly on them, with the restrictions that are ongoing, with the lack of transport and that is on, or restricted transport per se, they have been able to face quite a great challenge that they cannot be able to access. Those that have tried to move forward with this and maybe access these services, we see communication barriers, especially when it comes to persons that have a hearing impairment, communication between the service provider and themselves. Because in these services, during pandemics like these or crises like these, we don't see holistic services there. We cannot, we don't see, for example, a signage interpreter at this health center or at this center of service. So when they go there, they are at risk of actually not being given what they demand for, or even misinterpreted because there is no one there to act a bridge between the service provider and themselves. So it is quite a challenge on this, but we also see that there are also other services that are so essential for persons with disabilities during this time. Apart from sexual reproductive health, we see that there are services like physical rehabilitation that are so essential for persons with disabilities to continue having these sessions. We see that health centers are prioritizing cases of COVID-19, and there are no services, or there are no attention to other health services. And when it comes to settlement, because of limited services, we see that priority, of course, goes only to those cases, and maybe the available ambulances will only take priority of those cases. And we forget that actually disease is continuous. We are always getting sick and falling sick all the time. So with the restrictions in movement, it becomes very difficult for persons with disability to access other health services, notably even mental health services, which are quite, persons with mental health are face difficulties going in for their follow-up medications, going in for other services, psychological services. Why? Because there is that limitation to access the service. So we see all these, a combination of all these factors affecting a person with disability at that level in the settlement, but also in urban.
Of course, that is from the perspective of humanity and inclusion, but we would like to hear from the perspective of Nuwodu, the National Union of Women with Disabilities. And I'm talking about the social worker, Ms. Teresa Leber, who's also joining us via Skype. A very good afternoon once again, Ms. Teresa. How have the persons living with disabilities been impacted by this COVID-19 crisis, and how has that impacted on access to sexual, reproductive and maternal health services for these people?
In order to understand this, we need to understand what disability is. Disability has been defined by the Persons with Disabilities Act 2006 as a substantial functional limitation of daily living activities caused by impairment, due to impairment. And environmental barriers resulting in limited participation. The Uganda National Census has placed people with disabilities nationally at 14.4% of the total population of Uganda. This is not a small number. And most times, people who have different perceptions about disability and therefore judge them differently. It is also important to know that persons with disabilities are a diverse group because we have different types of disabilities. We have people with physical disability, visual impairment or the blind, the hearing impairment and the deaf, persons with mental disability, the epileptic, the intellectual disabilities, little persons, persons with noticing disease. All these are different types of disabilities, and their needs differ. Persons with disabilities, therefore, face different limitations depending on their disability and severity of the condition. Therefore, in a crisis condition like this, their limitations increase depending on the environment they are in, the conditions, for example, the restrictions posed by the pandemic. Their needs are different. And in the communities, people with disabilities are perceived differently depending on their gender. Women with disabilities in a crisis like this face a lot more limitations than their counterparts. Therefore, they undergo through a lot of challenges. Recently, we received a report of a 14-year-old girl defiled by a local councillor. Therefore, you can see the nature of problems they go through.
Indeed. Ms. Teresa, let's
in
talk
the communities.
Ms. Teresa, let's talk about the prevalence of violence among women living with disabilities, because right here with me is a study from UNFPA which indicates that young girls are 10 times more likely to undergo domestic or gender-based violence in that regard than other girls without disabilities. Is that true?
That is very true. Thank you so much. That is very true. Globally, there was a study done by UNFPA.
Indeed.
FPA that revealed that young girls with disabilities face up to 10 times more gender-based violence than those without disabilities. And girls with intellectual disability particularly are vulnerable to sexual abuse. Women and girls with disabilities, many of the same forms of violence, all women and girls with disabilities face different challenges. However, they suffer a higher risk of rape, twice as likely to, and domestic violence than other forms of gender-based violence and severe injuries. Children with disabilities are almost 4 times more likely to become victims of violence than children without disabilities, and nearly 3 times more likely to be subjected to sexual violence. I've just told you about the defilement of a 14-year-old girl.
Yes, by the LC.
By a counselor. Therefore, in the study also, the African Child Policy of Forum of Violence against children with disabilities, nearly every young person interviewed had been sexually abused at least once, and most more than once sometimes. Violence against children and young adults is a global epidemic. Data on violence against children are difficult to come by, largely because such violence often goes unreported. And because data collection is uneven, of differing reliability across countries and dependent on varied definitions of violence, the restrictions in movement coupled with the stay home have impacted on women with and girls with disabilities very severely.
Yes, Ms. Teresa, you've put a whole lot into
coupled
perspective, but then would like to know what recommendations would be right to actually handle that situation.
It is, thank you so much.
Yes.
There is need for government or responders to institute active helplines to help such people who suffer abuses.
Indeed.
We are aware that this COVID has restricted people in their homes. They cannot freely move to help centers. They have to get permission from somewhere, and they are locked down, and yet there are no borders, which are their main means of transport. So we need to have helplines for reporting feedback during crises like this COVID. Continued awareness also on GBV is very important. And if the effects of GBV, we need to also design strategies of easy access to the relevant authorities to address GBV violent cases.
Thank you very much, Ms. Teresa. At this point, let me bring in Annette. She's a GBV expert working with Care International, and she joins us via Skype. Annette, a very good afternoon once again. We would like to know the impact of COVID-19 on gender-based violence, specifically intimate partner violence, IPV.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. So before I even talk about GBV, I would like to share what the different communities understand by the word gender.
Please go ahead.
So, yeah, so when we look at gender, gender is basically a social construct. It is the way different communities view men and women in regards to their responsibilities and their roles. So these roles and responsibilities, they change from a given community to another. And it also looks at the access to resources, but also the roles men and women play in decision making. So these dynamics, which we call gender dynamics, they change. They change according to a context, but they also change during certain situations. For example, the COVID-19 situation. So you realize from even the discussions of my colleagues is that the impact of COVID-19 is going to be different on the men, on the women. It's going to be different on the girls and on the boys. So when we did this rapid gender analysis, it was for us to understand and be able to share with the government and other partners how are these different groups of people impacted. And when we do this, it's called having a gender lens. So when we have this gender lens, while implementing, for example, development programs, and while having this COVID-19 response, it helps us to have a more comprehensive and a more holistic approach towards meeting the needs of these different groups of people.
Yes.
So, like you said, when you look at issues like gender-based violence, child abuse, they're on the increase during this particular time.
Yes.
When we look at challenges in accessing sexual reproductive health and maternal newborn care, they're on the increase. Whereas we are seeing that some of the drivers of gender-based violence have been reduced. For example, alcohol, because many bars are closed. There is curfew in the times when many of the people who drink alcohol will be out drinking. So some of those drivers have reduced. But again, we see that the toil that the COVID-19 restrictions are taking, people are not able to go to work. So for the men, you have more expectations from your family, but probably you don't have an income at this point. And then like all our colleagues have discussed, like Doreen discussed, at this point as a woman, you have an increased care burden. You're working, you're on Skype, on the computer the whole day, but then you're supposed to caretake the family. So all those strains in the family are increasing. Yeah?
But then,
the
Annette,
incidence of gender-based violence.
Annette,
Yes.
you noted a reduction in the violence drivers, which is alcohol and promiscuity. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes, alcohol and promiscuity.
Yes,
So
yes.
if those
Yes.
if they are out of the picture, then what are the common forms of violence currently?
Yes, so the most forms of violence, of course, right now, we have, like you said, intimate partner violence, and it's brought, this is the kind of violence which is occurring within the home. And so now it takes us to look at what are those things within the home now that there is, okay, no alcohol. Probably the man is not going out to drink, the woman is not going out to drink, but then the man has an increased burden. There are increased expectations, or probably the expectations are the same as usual, but he's not getting a regular income, you see? And then we have children who before would have time to go and play with their friends. They would have time to go and fetch water and bring firewood home. But now we are saying that because as a mother, I am scared if I tell my children to go and fetch water, they could, play with other children, they could go to other communities, and they risk, transmission. So the burden is me. Where is the water, mommy? Where is the firewood? Is the food ready? Everyone is looking at you. So all these stresses. And then we also have, we also have the economic violence where for the case.
Go ahead, Annette.
The women have been, forced to draw on their small reserves. And where these reserves, get finished and the man cannot provide, the woman cannot provide, then these strains start. So all these pressures really increase the likelihood of intimate partner violence, but also child abuse, because when all these strains are happening between man and wife, then you expect an impact on the children and the other members of the family. And also we see that one of the challenges now with gender-based violence is that the previously social support systems that existed, that when we have an issue with my husband, with my wife, I'll run to a neighbor, I'll run to my auntie, I'll run to my father, my uncle, who will probably come and sit us down. Right now, I have no means of transport. Or I might have a means of transport, but then we don't want visitors. They don't want visitors in order because of the directives, you see. So also because before we had some implementing partners where you would go and, have a service provider talk to them. Some of these services have actually been scaled down at the community level.
I understand where you're coming from, Annette. But then I would like to know, how has the absence of these GBV workers from the COVID-19 response actually exacerbated issues to do with gender-based violence?
Yes, thank you. So like, when you have an issue and you have no one to turn to, so you can imagine what will happen.
Indeed.
So one, for example, when you look at issues of sexual violence, we have emergency treatment, the post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, the emergency contraception to prevent pregnancy. These treatments are supposed to be gotten very soon. But in cases where, for example, we don't have the people who used to support us in transportation of a survivor of sexual violence, then there is an issue. It means I cannot access these services. And also in cases where I need to access these treatments, they're emergency in nature, I should receive them within 72 hours. But then there isn't any other transport. There's no border. There is nothing. There's no one to support me to access these services. So that makes it worse, Yeah.
Yes, Annette, what would be the immediate recommendations you would have for maybe the various actors and first responders to actually address gender-based violence at this point in time?
Yeah, of course, just like the first thing is really awareness creation. To first of all let communities know that COVID-19 is impacting not only on women, but it's impacting on us as women, as men, as girls, as boys. So that if we are aware that this is most likely to impact on all of us, then you start watching out on those moments when you see those strains, when you see something building, some negative energy, then you're able to be conscious and probably talk through it at the family level. But also in terms of programming, to look at, for example, in terms of transportation, we've worked together with the different district task forces where CARE is implementing, and some of these districts have, for example, adopted, and they have given travel permits to borders who can have, you can wear a mask, but if you're transporting a pregnant mother, a survivor of GBV, you actually can get a travel permit to take this survivor to the health facility. And also, like CARE, we've taken on other approaches, and we also encourage other implementing partners and government to support, like a remote psychosocial support. So we give out numbers for helpers or for case workers, which communities are aware, and some of them are toll free, so they can call in, and then we give them psychosocial first aid, psychological first aid, or psychosocial support on phone, and then we are able to do follow-up. Yeah, and also we also encourage the partners and government to be able to provide emergency transportation. And of course, also we encourage, we know that sometimes even when this government transportation is there, there's this whole bureaucracy. So we are calling upon the different partners to avail the transport, but also reduce on the bureaucracies, and also the turnaround time of receiving this help for the person who has called in, for a survivor of GBV, for a mother, the turnaround time of them receiving this transport should actually be very short. Because we know that when one survivor needs help and they are not helped, this information goes around in the community. So you'll have survivors saying, oh, well, even if I call, they don't come. So it is very important for us also to review what we call the referral pathways. So before the COVID-19, we had partners who were known. You know that if there is a child who has been abandoned, I will contact so and so. If we have a survivor of GBV who needs transport or who need to stay overnight, we have a safe space, or we have a GBV shelter. So some of these referral pathways have actually been fragmented because some partners are not on the ground. So the other thing we now have to do actively on a daily basis is for us as partners and government to be able to map out the current referral pathways. Who are those partners who are on the ground and are working, so that when the survivors need these services, they actually find them the way they need to. Yes.
Wonderful insights from you, Annette. Thank you very much for those wonderful submissions. In studio, I also have Doreen, Mr. Innocent, and Dorothy. But then I'm coming to the RPM right now. Mr. Innocent, Annette noted a reduction in the violence, what are they? Yes, the violence drivers, which is alcohol. So alcohol is out of the picture. People are not drinking anymore because they are at home. And also promiscuity. Men are not cheating. Women are not cheating, so those violence, there's been a reduction in those violence drivers. But then we'd like to know what you are doing as government to address the implications of gender-based violence on our society.
Thank you very much. As government, we've put up systems. And of course, this is an unprecedented, disaster or epidemic. And these systems exactly are now at a test. So we have, as you very well know, security across the country with, the Child and Protection Unit. We have, of course, governance up to the local levels. And we have seen, especially during this period, the lowest government administrative bodies, the local council one systems coming in most handy than ever before. So we really are relying on these systems we have established and which have been in place, like the LC1 systems, the security, the police, which is up to, the grassroots. And for the refugee settlements, we have security presence in these refugee settlements. And as I earlier indicated, we have the Refugee Welfare Council 1, which is equivalent to our LC1, that's like a village refugee leadership, and the Refugee Welfare Council 2 and 3. These are the systems we really encourage everyone to rely on, to approach wherever there are these kinds of tendencies. As of course, even His Excellency the President during his addresses, he has noted this concern. Some cases of violence, domestic violence during this period. And that's why I'm saying this COVID-19 is definitely unprecedented and is impacting in different ways. But we are dealing with all these impacts as they come, and a lot of sensitizations are ongoing at the district levels, at sub-county levels, using especially the radios. Thank God for the privatization we've allowed, and we are seeing the reduction in this, and especially also the increased security presence. It could have been even worse than probably what is happening, but for the systems which have been put in place, they have really come in handy, and for those few reported cases, we are really handling as they arise, and we hope that these cases actually will drop, especially as we open up, the country.
Well, you did hint at the police's Child and Family Protection Unit as one of the avenues people could run to for help. But then we are also getting information that this unit is also working with the family court, which is now, whose operations are not, in order because of the whole COVID-19 crisis. So what is the rationale of that? Having a Child and Family Protection Unit which is working, but you do not have a family court to peruse through the cases that are being registered at the police court?
The judiciary is actually not really crossed per se. The judiciary is working, and as for the family court, this is really this deals with the cases relating to adoption, guardianship, and all that. So most of these cases coming up are really criminal in nature, and they are being dealt under criminal courts. Cases relating to custody, guardianship, and all that, all those can be put on hold in the meantime, but issues relating to criminal kind of nature are being handled by the courts, the criminal courts, which are operational. But the other kind of issues, like the district probation officers, they are working. The entire local government is working, and it's operational. So they are handling these cases, of course in liaison with the overall Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, which also is mandated and charged with these kinds of issues. And as well as for OPM, when it comes to refugee-related incidences, we are closely working with our partners, UNHCR, the CARE, among others, to see that these kinds of cases, whenever they arise, they are put in safe places within the settlements, and those who are responsible are definitely handled by the criminal courts with the security.
Well, of course, Innocent, following the onset of COVID-19, various task forces were created to, mitigate the response of COVID-19 and prevention. Well, women were also included within these task forces. How have they performed, and have issues to do with women been addressed?
Thank you. Women in Uganda really are participating across all levels, because our legal framework, our policy, framework are all inclusive. They are gender sensitive. In fact, everyone is praising our Ministry of Health, which is led by women.
Innocent, just yes. A moment. Maybe Doreen and Dorothy are adamant to pitch in, but then, according to the rapid assessment, the rapid gender assessment, and then the impact assessment study by Humanity and Inclusion actually indicates that women are not being actually represented on these task forces. You have most of the district task forces being headed by men, especially 75 to 92% of those members are men. So where are the women? And we believe that if you had a woman on this task force, she would at least express the problems of the women. So since we have men dominating these task forces, it would be prudent enough to ask, are the concerns of women being addressed? First of all, who is voicing these concerns to begin with?
Thank you very much. I think these district task force committees are not really operating in isolation. They have the central, which is, you know, giving the overall guidance. And this is the national, you know, task force. And this is an inclusive task force. It has given guidelines, it has given guidance. Now, when it comes to respective district task forces, of course, when it comes to chairing, these are being chaired by the resident district commissioner. So if a specific district has a female, or I mean a male district resident commissioner, then that is it. But I know for a fact that all these districts at least have female officers.
The good thing Doreen and Dorothy are around. Doreen, do you believe women are being fully represented in these task forces? And are your issues as women being addressed?
I just wanted to clarify that we need to kind of, I think, you know, demystify some of the issues because
please go ahead.
There is participation, there's meaningful participation, there's inclusion, there's being actively included. So we are not saying there are no women in the committee, but what is the role of the women? How are the concerns of the women being addressed?
How influential are their positions?
How influential are their positions on there? So I think we get inside there, and for me, if let's say the resident district commissioner is a male, the next level is how as a male are you considering issues affecting women? And I want to give the tiniest something about, there's an issue we're discussing recently, and it was around maternal health and you know, delivery. There is open access to, you know, to maternal services, yes?
Yes.
But there is issues around transportation. But you know, one of the concerns that the women raised was, okay, we are delivering, but we have nowhere to purchase the baby stuff that we need. And that is a nitty-gritty that as when you are when you're part of it, you can bring some of those little bits around it. So we might say, oh, the health service is fully catered for, but can we attend to every little bit? The other bit is around like sanitary towels. That is, it might not be a quick thing. You might know we are providing basics, but has anyone remembered that sanitary towels are basic for a girl child, are basic for women? So we provide the food, but is the sanitary towel coming along? Because, you know, that is a basic for a woman. So I think there is representation, but there is, are we addressing all the concerns of women? Are the women there able to participate? And we know we are affected by our background. Social cultural norms. We did interview in some places. The women hold some positions, but who has the influence at that space? That means the person in leadership takes a very deliberate effort to actually engage, to consult, and to give some wins, if I should say, so that if, you know, you've listed the issues and we're saying, you know, the issues are here, how many have been taken on? And that's how we count our advocacy wins, to say that, you know, these are issues we brought forward as women, these are issues that were brought forward by women with disabilities, and 1, 2, 3 were actually picked up. But if you bring a set of 10 recommendations and none of them is taken, and they say, oh, that's included, you know, that's part of health. But then for us, it was a specific health concern that we needed. So that's where we are coming from, to say that I think, yes, as we include, let's see what decisions are we taking? What issues have we taken that are coming from the direct communities, you know? Even if they're not, let's say they're not up there in leadership, but we took the deliberate effort to consult. How many of their suggestions did we take? And want to commend government at this moment that actually, initially, at the time we did the survey, the GBV was not considered an essential service, but very recently there was a directive from the President's office around including the community development services, which is very key around addressing, you know, these gender issues. So with that representation, but also with working in partnership, we shall see that improving and increasing. Already we are working with the community development services, the gender offices, the probation and welfare services, to come up with practical issues, to come up with the practical interventions that address the needs of the people, and we shall realize that meaningful involvement, which is not yet there.
You couldn't have put it more rightly, Doreen. Well, let's talk about the issue of coping mechanisms. How best are families and other households coping in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? This is going to you, Dorothy. Yeah. I read the report by the gender analysis report, and it indicated that some families might be forced to actually sell off their children, the young girls, in form of bride price, because the families cannot cope with the whole COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, after the lockdown is lifted, there will be that problem of how to cope with the whole issue. So in the report, it was indicated that families might be forced to engage of their young girls. And you would also have other issues. She talked about the VSLAs, you know, tapping into the savings. In your own assessment as humanity and inclusion, how are the families coping? What are the coping mechanisms undertaken by various families during this COVID-19 crisis?
Okay. In our assessment, we are able to look at a few areas. For example, social support networks. A few of the families that still had their relatives, had their social networks around them, I think they have coped positively than those that actually do not have their support networks, where people where their relatives or their support networks were either locked far apart from them, and they are struggling to meet ends meet in their own household. So it is big problem, I would say, and looking at persons with disabilities, if I may draw close attention to that, is that there's a lot of negative coping in this. And apart from the lack of the social support that they may have, I mean, they don't have much in terms of resources, they don't have much in terms of even food. We see that the different resources that they had are being utilized. The different livelihood options that they had are cut at this point in time. So there is that negative kind of coping, I would say, that may lead to what you have just said, being able to give their own girls, which is a very big risk. Looking for a way of survival, looking for a way of coping in that arena.
Indeed. Let's bring in Michelle, Annette, and Teresa. But I'm going to first begin with you, Michelle. In times of crisis, communities always find a way to cope, like we've been discussing here in studio. In your own assessment, and how are families coping with this whole COVID-19 crisis? Michelle.
Some of the ways they are coping is eating meals in a day. I've gotten some respondents saying that's whereby they will have 3, perhaps now they're having 2 and sometimes 1, depending on how large the family is. Other coping mechanisms is, like you said, some of them are negative. So they are selling off their children for child labor. Or negative impacts like that, but obviously there's also early and forced marriage. So there are some good mechanisms whereby some beneficiaries are actually coming together. Maybe one of them has a grinding mill, so they're working together to look for customers and then sharing profits. But others are really engaging in negative coping mechanisms, like eating the 1 meal a day, which is not healthy for young children. So yeah.
Let me also bring in Teresa to let us know how persons with disabilities are coping during this very trying time. Teresa.
Yes, please.
Yes, how are persons living with disabilities coping during this very trying time of COVID-19?
Looking at the challenges earlier talked, it's not easy. It has not been easy for them to cope up. Because the majority of persons with disabilities, especially women with disabilities, we could say they are dependent on what we may call hand-to-mouth activities, which has been their livelihood. During this lockdown, these activities are not taking place. For example, majority of women with disabilities are engaged in market vending. And by the way, in the markets, they do not have stalls. Some sit down on the floor. That is what they go through. Now, activities like market vending, a number of markets were closed. And coupled with the transport challenge, such women have not been doing their livelihood activities. There are those engaged in hairdressing. There are those who have small kiosks, food kiosks. There are those who are in tailoring. There are those who are selling agricultural produce and vegetables. There are those who go washing laundry services from home to home. All these activities have been locked because those who are doing laundry work, now people are locked down. Offices are locked. People are able to wash their own clothes. There's no the tailors cannot go to their work business places because of transport.
True.
Shops have been locked down for such a long time. Hairdressing salons are not there. This has gravely affected them. And then those who had substantive stalls in the markets were aware that they were supposed to sleep in the markets. This was not favorable for women, majority of women with disabilities.
Indeed.
As we know that women with this majority of this women with disability are single mothers, and the lockdown does not favor them doing their businesses in the markets. So it has affected them very adversely, and yet they are expected to put food on their tables. Children at home, they are supposed to stay with their children. It is not easy. It has not been easy for women with disabilities.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Teresa Leba. She is a social worker working with the National Union for Women with Disabilities. Thank you very much for your humble submission. Doreen, right now we would like to talk about the issue of livelihood challenges. Since this pandemic began, you've been hearing left, right and center the issue of livelihood challenges. So since this assessment was done in the rural, urban and refugee context, we would like to know what has been the impact. We want you to compare the livelihood challenges for the men, for the women and the refugees in those different contexts.
Thank you very much. I think Teresa has already spoken to a number of livelihoods challenges, and I'm just going to bring it from the context of the urban, the rural and the refugee.
Yes, she gave us the refugee part.
When we look at the livelihood challenges, of course, when you think livelihood, you think source of income, source of survival. So you're looking at, if you're looking at implications for men and women, we're looking at, informal sector, non-formal sector, formal and informal sector. And what does that mean? A large number of women are employed in the informal sector. A large number of women are in the subsistence farming. So when you look at the context, you realize that in the urban context, in terms of livelihood, there has been a lot of disruption of livelihoods for the women and the men, of course, working in the urban environment and the urban context, because in terms of their businesses have been put to a halt. When we come to the rural context, we realize that, of course, they're highly dependent on agriculture. It has been a plus for them because access to food is not a big challenge, but however, they're eating up what they would have sold for survival. So it has all turned into, they've turned that into food. And what has happened is, I think you had noted that before, that, the season came, or it's probably still ongoing, but access to to planting food for the next season. They cannot move. Much as Innocent tells us that the government, says that's an open sector that is working, but how are people going to get to the markets?
Indeed.
How do they go to get to their supplies? And how do they transport what they need to their locations? So they're having all those challenges. And in the refugee context, just to add on to that, is that when the food ratios came down, there's now struggle for resources and there's increased violence.
Indeed. Let me bring in Annette and we talk about access to the health services that we've been talking about. Annette, if you're hearing me, would like to know the impact of COVID-19 on access to sexual, reproductive and maternal health services.
Sorry, my network broke. I didn't hear you very well.
Yes, we are now talking about access to health services. How has COVID-19 impacted access to sexual, reproductive and maternal health services?
Yeah, thank you so much. So like we said, I think the largest challenge around access to service is how do I get there
Indeed.
to the health facility. So in terms of, failure to get transport, but even when I get it, those are the things that I need to go through to be able to get that transport. But also, the time we conducted this rapid gender assessment, none of the areas where we conducted the assessment had got a case of COVID-19. However, you could still see that the health facilities, the service provision had been affected because the health workers were fewer at that time. The public transport had just stopped, so some of the respondents said when they went, the health workers were fewer, and then they were told it's because some couldn't get a transport to come to work. But also, we've seen that some of the mothers themselves, for example, the mothers who have sick children, they are even worried of taking their children to the hospitals because they are wondering how safe are we in case this facility actually gets a COVID-19 patient. You've seen some of the stories you've been covering on the media when they say they have taken a COVID-19 person suspected in a health facility. You've seen how you've been showing us news that everyone else ran away. So there is that care, but also the health workers themselves, especially those who still say that they don't have enough protective equipment, the PPE, they are also still worried, as much as they're in the hospital, but they are very suspicious of whoever comes in. You come in with a normal cough, a normal, flu, and so even the health workers are very concerned.
I see where you're coming from, Annette. Thank you. Thank you very much for that humble submission. And we are almost coming to an end of this conversation, but we cannot get out of here before giving you some recommendations to some of the challenges we've highlighted right here on the show. I do have Innocent from the Office of the Prime Minister. Would like to know, as a representative of the government, what would be the recommendations for various actors to ease the implications of COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you very much. Currently, I must say the situation is much a bit easier than at the beginning. And you'll note that actually this study was conducted around that time. So a lot has really changed. And as government begins to ease, this lockdown, we're going to see, the situation improve much more than it has been. As government, of course, we've been studying the situation. There's been a regular communication by His Excellency the President himself, and we've seen him even come and do more clarities, and he will continue, of course, giving these communications. Our call is the need to, ensure this communication reaches the very rural areas. And that is being done, and we hope it will continue to be even done better. We call on all actors to really try and support government to pass on this communication in all forms, and it's more especially to see that those we feel are really disadvantaged and cannot easily access this are able to access it.
Indeed. I also do have Doreen, your recommendations before we call it wraps.
Thank you very much. I think for me, tops at the moment is the issue of coordination. And we have learned that from the humanitarian setting. For all services to be coordinated, we need to see that replicated in the development context and in the rural, so that all services are coordinated. And of course, we are adapting. everything. We don't know when COVID is ending. You know, just like Innocent has already said, when we did the survey, the stats was different. We need to do another, like the rapid, every, you know, periodical assessments to check where are we at, adapt our programming and get practical solutions and, you know, stick to that from time to time, keep speaking to each other and consulting our communities to see what's practical for them and also what fits within the guidelines.
But I have to laud Care International for having come up with that rapid gender analysis study. It has been really helpful. I mean, look at the subjects we've been expounding on. Really, really important and crucial information. And of course, not least, we also have Humanity and Inclusion that also conducted an impact assessment study on some of the refugee settlements and also non-refugee settlements, which is still ongoing. So help us understand, what would be the immediate recommendations from your side?
Yes, immediate recommendation from Humanity and Inclusion will be one, inclusive communication that caters for all populations, inclusive service delivery that focuses on basically access to these services, which has been a hindrance to persons with disability. And lastly, taking into consideration vital aspects of vital services like mental health and psychosocial support.
Indeed. Amazing, amazing insights coming in from Dorothy, Mr. Innocent, and Doreen from Care International. We also had some three panelists via Zoom. That is Annette. We also had Michelle and Miss Teresa. Thank you very much for having made the time to speak to NTV. The show has been largely centered around the rapid gender analysis study that was conducted by Care International, Humanity and Inclusion in conjunction with the Office of the Prime Minister. You've had some very, very good insights from Innocent. There is reprieve that is coming your way. The importance of this conversation couldn't be spelled out in bold letters, but then you've gotten a gist, one or two of what we were talking about. And yes, help is coming your way. If you are actually grappling with any case of GBV, intimate partner violence, just call on to the authorities. They are more than willing to give you the help that you need. My name is Romeo Busiku. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having made the time from 3 p.m. up to now. Have yourselves a blessed day.